The Hall of the United Nations has heard thousands of speeches. Many were polite, many were predictable, and most were forgotten the moment the applause faded. But this time, something different happened. A voice from the Global South, India's External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar spoke not with the language of protocol, but with the conviction of truth. He did not bow to the weight of old hierarchies. He stood firm, greeted the world with a simple namaskar from Bharat, and in that small moment he carried the power of centuries, a nation reclaiming its true name, refusing to be defined by its colonizers. For those of us in Africa, this gesture was more than symbolic. It was a reminder of what we too must embrace: our own names, our own histories, our own right to speak without apology. Jaishankar's words rang like a bell across the Global South. He declared that the United Nations is in crisis, a truth small nations have whispered for decades, but rarely dared to say aloud. He spoke of terrorism not in cautious euphemisms, but with fearless clarity. He recalled the humiliation of vaccine apartheid during COVID-19. He exposed the quiet chains of modern colonialism, supply chains, technology monopolies, and financial rules designed to keep us dependent. But most importantly, he offered something rare in diplomacy: a way forward. With three guiding principles: self-reliance, self-defense, and self-confidence, he sketched a roadmap for how the Global South can reclaim dignity and build a new order rooted not in domination, but in solidarity. So here's the question: will Africa, and especially leaders like Burkina Faso's President Ibrahim Traoré, take up this challenge? Will we finally stand not as objects in world politics, but as architects of a just future? If you believe these questions matter, stay with us. Please share if you feel you are one of the first to know about and support President Ibrahim Traoré. And subscribe if you believe the truth is more important than the headlines. When Dr. S. Jaishankar walked to the podium at the United Nations, the expectation was for yet another diplomatic routine: cautious praise, vague appeals, and polite silence about the real crises facing the world. Instead, what emerged was a speech that cut through decades of hypocrisy. The very first word he chose was not India as the world has come to know the nation, but Bharat. This choice of identity was not accidental. It was deliberate. It was a reminder that the Global South can no longer afford to wear names handed down by colonial masters. Bharat was a declaration of authenticity, a civilization reclaiming its original dignity. For Africans who have lived through centuries of names imposed, borders drawn, and narratives twisted by outsiders, this gesture carried a profound resonance. It was a lesson in how even the smallest act of self-definition can shake the foundations of a system built on domination. From that moment, Jaishankar began dismantling illusions. His assessment of the United Nations was as blunt as it was true. An objective report card will show that the UN is in a state of crisis. For decades, smaller nations have whispered this in frustration, knowing the institution that promised equality had become a tool of selective power. Hearing this truth spoken openly by a representative of one of the world's rising powers was more than refreshing. It was vindication. The crisis of the UN is not theoretical. It is lived reality. In Africa, countless conflicts have burned while the global spotlight stayed fixed elsewhere: Rwanda, Darfur, the Sahel, the Congo. Lives lost without headlines. Entire regions destabilized without ever entering the speeches of Western leaders. Jaishankar's words finally acknowledged what millions of Africans already knew in their bones: that the world order has chosen which lives matter and which can be forgotten. He went further, pointing to the selective attention given to Ukraine and the Middle East while countless other hotspots are erased from international consciousness. His message was sharp: the suffering of people in one region must not blind the world to the suffering elsewhere. For Africans, this was a mirror held up to decades of neglect. How many massacres, how many displacements, how many famines have we endured, while being told our crises were regional issues of little global consequence? Jaishankar's honesty forced the Assembly to confront what it has tried to ignore: that the so-called guardians of humanity are selective in their compassion. But perhaps the most striking part of the event was Jaishankar's directness on terrorism. Where most leaders cloak their words in euphemisms, he named the problem with courage. India has a neighbor that is an epicenter of global terrorism. This was not just an Indian reality. It was a universal truth about how entire ecosystems of violence are allowed to fester under political excuses. For Africa, this was a revelation of solidarity. In the Sahel nations like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger know the cost of terrorism, not as theory, but as daily life: villages burned, soldiers ambushed, children orphaned. And too often the world has demanded that African leaders stay diplomatic, that they avoid naming the sponsors, the financiers, the enablers. Jaishankar broke that silence. His demand for relentless pressure on the entire terrorism ecosystem echoed exactly what the Sahel Alliance has been calling for: no more half measures, no more selective definitions of terrorism, no more tolerance for those who destabilize under the cover of friendship. Equally powerful was his reminder of the failures exposed during the COVID-19 pandemic. He described vaccine apartheid, where rich nations hoarded doses and imposed travel bans on Africans while their own citizens flew freely despite outbreaks. For Africans, this was not distant history. It was humiliation lived in real time. Our populations were treated as expendable testing grounds, denied the dignity of equal treatment in a crisis that claimed millions of lives worldwide. Jaishankar's words were not abstract diplomacy. They gave voice to wounds still raw. By naming this injustice, he connected Africa's silent outrage with a global call for fairness. Yet amid these criticisms, what made the event historic was that Jaishankar did not stop at exposing failures. He offered a blueprint, 3 guiding principles: Atma-nirbhar, self-reliance; Atma-raksha, self-defense; and Atma-vishwas, self-confidence. Each principle was more than philosophy. It was a challenge to every nation of the global South. Self-reliance, he explained, does not mean isolation, but intelligent independence. It is the courage to build capabilities at home instead of depending perpetually on external powers. Self-defense is more than armies. It is the defense of sovereignty values and the right to choose one's partners without foreign approval. And self-confidence is the foundation, the conviction that nations of the global South are not beggars at the table of world politics, but rightful participants with heritage, resources, and populations that matter. For Africa, these principles felt like an echo of our own struggles. How often have we been told to look outward for salvation, while our resources are extracted and our youth are told they have no future at home? How often have we been lectured about governance while being denied the tools to govern? Jaishankar's roadmap was a reminder that the chains are not permanent, that self-definition, self-reliance, and self-confidence are possible if leaders dare to act. The event, therefore, was more than a speech. It was a rupture in the fabric of predictable diplomacy. A rising power from the global South declared openly what Africans have whispered for decades: the system is broken, the inequities are real, and the time for change has arrived. And in that declaration, the seeds of a new partnership between Africa and India were sown, rooted in shared history and shared defiance. The turning point of Dr. Jaishankar's speech came when he shifted from analysis to confrontation. His words no longer described the state of the world, they challenged it. In the chamber where caution and compromise usually dominate, he spoke with the sharpness of truth. India has a neighbor that is an epicenter of global terrorism. The hall grew tense. Diplomats shifted uncomfortably, unused to hearing such clarity in a place built on euphemisms. But for millions listening across the global South, especially in Africa, those words were liberating. For decades, African leaders have been told to be diplomatic about terrorism, to call it extremism, instability, or security challenges. They were instructed not to name the sources, not to accuse the powerful nations that quietly enable chaos for strategic gain. Jaishankar's refusal to play that game struck a chord. He named the threat directly and in doing so gave permission to others to do the same. For countries in the Sahel, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, where terrorism tears villages apart and foreign mercenaries exploit the violence, this was not rhetoric. It was solidarity. It was recognition of their reality on the floor of the United Nations. This moment of candor ignited the emotional peak of the speech. The minister went further, demanding relentless pressure on the entire terrorism ecosystem. Not half measures, not selective strikes, not political bargaining, but full accountability. For Africans watching, it was as though someone had finally spoken the words they had long carried in silence. Terrorism is not only bombs and bullets. It is a system of money flows, arms, trafficking, propaganda networks, and political protection. By naming this, Jaishankar shattered the illusion that terrorism can be managed politely. He insisted that it must be dismantled completely. Reactions were immediate. In Western media, his words were reported cautiously framed as India's strong statement. But across Africa, especially in the Sahel, the response was electrifying. Commentators in Ouagadougou and Bamako praised the courage to speak plainly in a hall that has too often been a theater of denial. On social platforms, young Africans quoted his words alongside the slogans of their own struggles. In Niger, where people have marched against foreign bases, Jaishankar's stance was read as a validation. Africa is not alone in naming the forces that destabilize it. The emotional intensity rose again when he addressed the failures of the COVID-19 response. His reminder of vaccine apartheid drew nods across the global south. He recalled how wealthy nations hoarded doses while Africans were banned from travel and treated as expendable. The hall was silent, but outside the reaction was visceral. In South Africa, editorialists wrote that his speech captured the humiliation their citizens endured. In Kenya and Ghana, radio hosts replayed his remarks as proof that the injustice was not forgotten. The memory of entire populations waiting helplessly for shipments that never came was reignited. His words gave voice to that indignity and transformed it into political capital. Yet what prevented the speech from collapsing into anger alone was Jaishankar's balance of critique with vision. Having reached the peak of confrontation, terrorism pandemic, injustice, global neglect, he turned to a message of hope. His articulation of Atmanirbhar self-reliance, Atmaraksha self-defense, and Atmavishwas self-confidence provided a constructive outlet for the outrage. This shift from exposing wounds to prescribing healing created the speech's dramatic arc from truth-telling through indignation to empowerment. The reactions reflected this balance. Governments in Africa issued statements of appreciation, highlighting his recognition of Africa's need for a permanent seat on the Security Council. Civil society groups echoed his call for fairness in global supply chains. Meanwhile, in Western capitals, diplomats scrambled to frame his words as partnership language, trying to soften the sting of his critique. But the global South heard the truth clearly. The age of polite silence was over. This was the climax, the moment when a leader from the global South broke the unspoken rules of the UN floor. He spoke with a candor that resonated across continents. And in that resonance, Africa found not only a mirror of its struggles, but also a partner in its defiance. The impact of Dr. Jaishankar's words did not end with applause inside the UN chamber. His speech began rippling outward, shaping conversations in streets, parliaments, and newsrooms across the global South. For ordinary people in Africa, the echoes of his message were deeply personal. He had spoken of injustices they had lived through, the humiliation of being denied vaccines, the experience of terrorism devastating their villages, the sting of being ignored in global crises. Suddenly, those stories were not dismissed as local complaints. They were recognized on the world stage by a major power. That recognition carried dignity. Civilians in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger nations, scarred by insurgencies, heard in his words a validation of their suffering. For years, they were told that their pain was a regional issue. Now, the acknowledgement that terrorism is part of a global ecosystem gave their struggle new weight. Communities mourning their dead could see their plight as part of a larger fight for justice, not just an isolated tragedy. This psychological shift matters. People who feel invisible often lose faith in politics. But when their reality is affirmed at the United Nations, hope is rekindled that change is possible. Politically, the consequences were even more pronounced. Jaishankar's call for relentless pressure on terrorism and his critique of vaccine apartheid stirred debate in African legislatures. Lawmakers in Ghana and Senegal referenced his speech when demanding fairer global health policies. In Nigeria, parliamentarians cited his remarks to push for stronger domestic action against terror sponsors. Across the Sahel, military-led governments pointed to his honesty as justification for their own break with Western narratives. His intervention became a tool in the political arsenal of those demanding reform. Internationally, his demand for Security Council reform struck a particularly strong chord. For decades, African nations have lobbied for permanent representation, but were met with polite dismissal. Jaishankar's support changed the conversation. No longer was this just Africa complaining about injustice. Now, a rising power of the Global South was amplifying the call. Within weeks, regional media in Africa framed the demand not as an aspiration, but as a necessity for global legitimacy. Citizens began to ask if India, with its 1.4 billion people, and Africa with its 1.3 billion, have no permanent voice. How can the Security Council claim to represent the world? The speech also sharpened the contrast between rhetoric and reality in the West's engagement with Africa. While Western leaders continued to preach democracy and governance, Jaishankar highlighted the hypocrisy of denying resources and equal treatment during crises. Civil society groups in Kenya and Uganda seized on his words to argue that lectures without partnership are meaningless. His critique empowered activists to demand accountability not just from foreign powers, but from their own governments that remain too dependent on external validation. Perhaps most significantly, his philosophy of self-reliance, self-defense, and self-confidence resonated as a blueprint for African sovereignty. Commentators in Ouagadougou linked it directly to President Ibrahim Traoré's policies of rejecting imposed models and asserting national control over resources. In South Africa, analysts drew parallels between India's civilizational confidence and Africa's need to embrace its role as the cradle of humanity. The message was clear: the global South must stop waiting for permission to lead. In the end, the civil and political consequences of Jaishankar's speech were not limited to diplomacy. They ignited conversations in classrooms, markets, and government halls. They offered a sense of legitimacy to the struggles of ordinary Africans and a tool for leaders seeking reform. And most of all, they demonstrated that when truth is spoken boldly at the global level, it can empower entire societies to reimagine their place in the world. For the United States and its allies, Dr. Jaishankar's speech was more than a diplomatic address, it was a warning shot. Washington has long assumed that nations of the global South would remain silent, dependent, and deferential. Yet, here was India, a rising power aligning itself, not with the West's agenda, but with the grievances and aspirations of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The message was unmistakable: the old hierarchy of international politics is eroding. American analysts quickly recognized the implications. By openly declaring that the United Nations is in crisis and that Africa deserves permanent representation on the Security Council, Jaishankar undermined the very structure that secures Western dominance. In think tanks from Washington to Brussels, questions arose: if India champions Africa's demand for a seat at the table, how long before this becomes an unstoppable coalition? For decades, the West has managed to keep reform at bay through delay and distraction. But now a major power is forcing the issue into the spotlight. Globally, the reaction was equally striking. Across Latin America, leaders sympathetic to South-South cooperation praised his vision. In Asia, smaller nations weary of being pawns in U.S.-China rivalry found encouragement in his call for multilateralism that serves all, not just the privileged few. Russia and China, while cautious, quietly welcomed a speech that challenged Western narratives without directly aligning with their own. Europe, meanwhile, responded with unease, portraying the address as constructive criticism while privately fearing the erosion of its influence. For Africa, the significance was profound. To hear a nation like India echo demands long voiced by Burkina Faso's President Ibrahim Traoré and the Sahel alliance gave new legitimacy to their struggle for sovereignty. The speech made clear that the global South no longer speaks in whispers. It speaks in unison, and the world is listening. The speech of Dr. Jaishankar was not merely words carried on microphones in the UN hall. It was a signal, a tremor running through the foundations of a world order that has stood unchallenged for decades. He reminded us that islands of prosperity cannot survive in oceans of turbulence, and that no nation can wall itself off from injustice without eventually being consumed by it. For Africa, these were not abstract ideas. They were warnings rooted in lived experience. From the Sahel to the Congo, from the Horn of Africa to the Cape, we have seen how neglect, terrorism, and inequality spill across borders. But the greater warning was for the world itself. If the United Nations continues to operate as a club of the powerful, if reforms are delayed, if Africa remains without a permanent voice, then legitimacy will crumble. In such a vacuum, nations will no longer look to multilateral institutions for justice. They will forge their own alliances, their own orders, and the West will find itself irrelevant. This is not a threat. It is an inevitability if change does not come. At the same time, Jaishankar's vision was not one of despair, but of possibility. He showed us that self-reliance, self-defense, and self-confidence are not dreams for the future. They are principles we can live by now. In Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim Traoré is already testing these ideas, nationalizing resources, redefining sovereignty, and challenging imposed models of governance. The question is whether Africa as a whole will find the courage to follow. Do you think that President Ibrahim Traoré's national reform strategies are truly effective yet? Or should Africa look beyond him for the next leader to carry this torch? This is where you come in. The future of Africa and of the global South cannot be left to speeches alone. It depends on awareness, on solidarity, and on people willing to demand more. Please share if you feel that you are one of the first to know about and support President Ibrahim Traoré. Subscribe if you believe that the truth is more important than the headlines. And most importantly, leave a comment below. Because history is not written by the powerful alone. It is written by those who refuse to stay silent.